Tonight on the Worldview Weekend Hour, how the Marxists are using the United Nations to destroy America from within. They've literally brought their propaganda into America's schools, and we're paying for it. And the average American has no idea what we're about to present. The Worldview Weekend Hour begins right now.
WVW-TV presents the Worldview Weekend Hour with Brannon and Howse. Whether the topic is law, science, government, economics, history, family, social issues, education, or theology, Brannon brings the issues of today into clear focus through the lens of a biblical worldview. And now, here is your host, Brannon Howse.
Good evening and welcome to the Worldview Weekend Hour and part 4 on our series, Brainwashed America. If you were with us last week, you will remember that we left off with this question right here. It's actually point 2 in a 10-point strategy for how you brainwash people. Just to remind anyone who's new and joining us, I have been studying now for, several years, brainwashing, propaganda, information warfare, fake news. The term fake news is kind of new, but the idea of fake news for propaganda purposes is not new at all. And that's what I've been studying for many years. And more recently and intensely, the last few months, I've been studying the writings of a man by the name of Edward Hunter, who in the 50s was very involved in studying the 1949 Communist Revolution in China. Many Americans have forgotten, or maybe they never knew. Maybe they don't understand the fact that China's not always been a communist nation. There was a communist revolution there in 1949. And Edward Hunter, as a journalist and someone who worked for the Office of Strategic Services, a forerunner to the CIA, he studied, is a forerunner to several other intelligence projects as well. He studied how the communists infiltrated the minds of the Chinese people and carried out a communist revolution there in China. So I've been studying him. And then we're looking at the writings and speeches of a man by the name of William Mayer, who studied how our own POWs during the Korean War were brainwashed, how they were literally, in some cases, turned against America without any drugs or without any torture, just simply by re-education. And we've learned that one of the things they first did was move leaders out of the way. They had to move leaders out of the way. We determined in our previous programs they only had to move away about 5% of the other POWs from the remaining 95%. So they would immediately size up the men. If any of them were religious, boom, off to a reactionary camp you went. If you were prone to showing any inclination toward organizing, leading, interrupting the brainwashing, going against the worldview of the communists there in the Korean Wars, they had our American POWs in their custody, then you went off to a reactionary camp. And again, from the studies by William Mayer, who was working for our U.S. military, particularly the Army, to conduct this study, we found that the communists only needed to move away about 5% of the POWs from the other POWs. And once those 5% were moved aside, there were no leaders. Once there were no leaders, there was no discipline, there was no organization, there was no resistance, there was no organizing. There was only surrender. In fact, there was no hope. And some of the young men would simply pull the covers up over their head and they'd be dead within 48 hours. And they didn't have a term for this. It was something new our military had never seen in our American military. And the men of the POW camps of the Korean War termed it give-up-itis. So point 1 was you got to demoralize and characterize men who are leaders, people of character. You got to move them aside, or if you can't move them aside, at least marginalize them and characterize them. Point 2, where we finished off last week, we'll continue this week, is enticing the brainwashing subject into questioning and doubting their foundational worldview, values, and convictions. Entice the brainwashing subjects into questioning and doubting their foundational worldview, values, and convictions. Let's start off with that report written during the Korean War by the Chief of Intelligence of the Chinese People's Voluntary Army, Tu Pei-ping. Now I want you to understand, what are we reading here? We're reading a report that was written by the Chief of Intelligence of the Chinese People's Voluntary Army, back to his leaders. Here's what he wrote about our American POWs during the Korean War. Quote, The American soldier has weak loyalty to his family, his community, his country, his religion, and to his fellow soldier. His concepts of right and wrong are hazy and ill-informed. Opportunism is easy for him. By himself, he feels frightened and insecure. He underestimates his own worth, his own strength, and his own ability to survive. There is little understanding of American political history and philosophy, the federal, state, and community organizations, state and civil rights, freedom, safeguards, checks and balances, and how these things allegedly operate within his own system. He fails to appreciate the meaning of and the necessity for military or any other form of organization. Well, my friends, you could just simply pass that off as being the claptrap of the communist, right? Of the Chinese communist. But reality is the studies that were done by our own military shows that indeed was a real, honest, straightforward report on the condition of the worldview of our American POWs. They just did not know enough. Even in the 1950s, having been products of our schools in the 1940s, they had not learned enough about our form of government, our constitutional republic, our way of life, our institutions, our economy, the checks and balances, and why he was even over there fighting. And so they were easily brainwashed because they did not have the information they needed to fight off the brainwashing. Well, sadly, my friends, that's going on in America even now. Many Americans, both student, elementary, high school, college and university, as well as adults, grown adults, don't have enough information. They don't have enough knowledge or understanding of our way of life, our form of government, our Constitution, our constitutional republic. Many people don't even know we're a constitutional republic. They would call us a democracy. The Founding Fathers called that mobocracy, the rule of the 51%. The Founding Fathers said, no, we deliberately chose to be a constitutional republic. And for any of the territories to be entered into the Union, they had to submit their application, their state constitution, and their form of government had to be that of a constitutional republic. But how many Americans know this? How many Americans understand our history and know what has made America great and free and prosperous for so long? How many Americans realize that there is fake history all through our textbooks? Would they even recognize it? Or would they be like the men of the POW camps of the Korean War, our own U.S. soldiers, who didn't know enough about their own way of life, their own country they were fighting for, to be able to recognize a lie when it was told to them by the communists in those POW camps? Well, my friend John Stormer, who passed away this past summer, in the summer of 2018, wrote an excellent book I highly recommend all of you read. It sold over 7 million copies, and it was called None Dare Call It Treason. I think I've told you the story about how John, on my radio show, had told the story about sitting in the back of the auditorium when he was campaigning for Barry Goldwater, along with another young man whose name was Ronald Reagan. And John Stormer and Ronald Reagan struck up a conversation and a friendship. And None Dare Call It Treason had just come out, and Ronald Reagan, John has told us on our radio show, Ronald Reagan used to order up None Dare Call It Treason by the case and give it out, give it away. It's a book that greatly influenced Ronald Reagan. And when you read None Dare Call It Treason, that sold 7 million copies, you'll understand a lot of what Ronald Reagan was doing and why. You'll understand where he learned some of it by reading that book, None Dare Call It Treason. Well, my friend John Stormer wrote this in that book, None Dare Call It Treason. Indoctrination and re-education was accomplished in simple discussion periods. American-produced books and texts were used which emphasized all that was bad in America. The 12-page outline given each man was prepared in America at a communist-operated school, the Jefferson School of Social Science in New York City, end quote. What's he talking about? The communists in the Korean War, when they captured our U.S. servicemen, they began to put them through re-education. That's another word for brainwashing. Indoctrination, re-education, fake history, information operation, fake news. But they were lining them up in rows in a very formal setting like a classroom and passing out a 12-page outline, a course written by the communists in America. The little book was written by communists in America and being used there in the Korean War in the POW camps to re-educate the American soldier. And again, because they did not have enough understanding of our way of life and our form of government, they had a very difficult time resisting this brainwashing. And remember, they really didn't have any leaders there to help them because those leaders had been moved aside to reactionary camps, so they could not pollute the minds of those 95%. John Stormer and none dare call it treason wrote, if the student didn't have a solid foundation in American history, government, and economics, much of the material made sense and sounded reasonable. Well, my friends, we have seen throughout our previous 3 lessons that there are 3 powerful institutions for brainwashing: education, media, and religion. And we keep coming back to these, and we'll keep coming back to these in our future broadcast. These 3 powerful institutions of education and media and religion. Well, let's talk about how the communist, the Islamist, and the United Nations hijacks and has hijacked American education for indoctrination. Did you know that the communists and the Islamists and the United Nations have hijacked our educational system in America? Many of you are aware of Common Core under the Obama administration. Did you know it goes all the way back to the United Nations? But did you know this isn't just a Democrat thing? My first book was in 1993, Cradle to College and Educational Abduction. I saw where on Amazon today you can buy Cradle to College and Educational Abduction. You can buy it for $179. I guess that's how rare that 1993 book is, that someone's offering it up. Only one copy I found for that much. I wish I could have sold it for $179 a copy when I wrote it, but nonetheless, the book is still out there. If you want to pay that for it, I wouldn't suggest you do that. But I wrote that book in 1993, and my second book came out in 1995 called Reclaiming a Nation at Risk. I'll show you the cover of that in a minute. But what I laid out in those books, particularly the one in 1995, was that what George W. Bush proposed through America 2000, written at the National Governors Association level by a young Southern governor by the name of Bill Clinton, along with Lamar Alexander. And Lamar Alexander ended up no longer being the governor of Tennessee, my home state here of Tennessee. He became the Secretary of Education for George H. Bush, and that left a young Southern governor from Arkansas named Bill Clinton to help finish up writing the plan at the National Governors Association. And it was unveiled in the George H. Bush Rose Garden as America 2000. And that was unveiled by Mr. George H. Bush himself, the one who wanted to tell us about the New World Order, his words, not mine, in a speech before Congress, and how we needed to embrace a New World Order, using the United Nations to do it. So would you be shocked to find out that that same George H. Bush had an education plan that went all the way back to the United Nations? A Republican. Well, he couldn't go very far with it, but the man who helped write it as a Southern governor from Arkansas, Bill Clinton, he ended up becoming president next. And he changed the name from America 2000 to Goals 2000. Now, I wrote about this in my book in 1995, but notice we went Republican and Democrat. And again, tied to the United Nations, global standards, 21st century schools, all kinds of fancy names. But at the end of the day, it was nothing more than outcome-based education. In my book, Reclaiming a Nation at Risk, was one of the first books ever written. Actually, it was my first book, Cradle to College and Educational Abduction, then Reclaiming a Nation at Risk, were 2 of the first books ever written on outcome-based education, effective objectives to change the attitudes, values, feelings, and beliefs of America's students through a psychological program of challenging their fixed beliefs that were fixed there by their parents. A form of education to undermine our American way of life and to call into question the virtues and values that have made America great. That was America 2000 that became Goals 2000 under the Clinton administration. And then under the George W. Bush administration, it became No Child Left Behind. Under Obama, now back to a Democrat, it became Common Core. But you see, my friends, all along it's been tied to a global education plan. The man who helped write it, in part, was a man by the name of Robert Mueller. I write about him extensively in my 2008 book, Grave Influence, which you can still get, and you will not have to pay $179 for it. You can still get that on our website at WVW-TV.com/bookstore. And I write extensively about outcome-based education and Robert Mueller. He was Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. It is said that he added more divisions to the United Nations than anyone. He was known as the father of global education. And he believed greatly in the idea of globalism, internationalism, really Well, socialism. And as Assistant Secretary General of the UN, he greatly admired someone by the name of Alice Bailey. I have a whole chapter on her in the book Grave Influence. Alice Bailey was an occultist. She had an entity she claimed to channel, and she and that entity wrote over 10,000 pages together, and that 10,000 pages amounted to many, many books. I write about her also in my book Marxianity that came out last year. Well, Robert Mueller was greatly influenced by Alice Bailey, who was really channeling nothing less, I believe, than a demon. And Alice Bailey talked about world government and New Age concepts and ideas and how they would bring about world government and socialism and do away with the old rhythms and the old ways and the old religions that were holding things back, i.e. conservatives and Christians were holding things back. Well, Robert Mueller at the UN had a lot of respect for this occultist Alice Bailey. In fact, when he left the United Nations, he set up a school to teach America's teachers on how to teach the concepts of occultist New Ager Alice Bailey. Well, Robert Mueller was greatly involved in helping to create what were known as global schools, global education. Robert Mueller, all the way there to the United Nations. And so, folks, this continues today. But prior to all that, did you know there was something else that came about before America 2000 under George H., before Goals 2000 under Bill Clinton, before No Child Left Behind under George W., before Common Core by Barack Obama, before all that? There was another global education plan that was, in many ways, was the test program, the pilot program for bringing about global education, UN curriculum, socialist curriculum in the schools of the world. Understand, my friends, these global education plans we've been doing here in America are simply America's version of a global education plan. I document these in many, many of my books. And online, you'll find many articles by many researchers who also document what I'm telling you tonight. But before America 2000, before Goals 2000, before Common Core, before No Child Left Behind, there was something called the International Baccalaureate. And it was the UN's first step into global education to indoctrinate and brainwash children in America into global ideas and to move them away from believing in our form of government, our ideas, our values, our constitutional republic. And so, my friends, the question is this: are our children any more aware today of the lies they're being told by the communists, by the socialist, by the globalist, than were the men of the 1950s who were in the POW camps and being re-educated by the communist? How about the parents? When the parents see this curriculum their child is learning, are they well educated enough on America's history and way of life to know their child is being brainwashed? Or have they already been brainwashed so they don't recognize it themselves? Let's look at that tonight. Here is a quote by American Communist Party leader William Z. Foster. Now notice the date, 1932, and it's in his book, Toward Soviet America. Notice what the title of the book is, Toward Soviet America. Remember now, he's a Communist Party leader, and he's writing this in 1932. Here's what he wrote, quote, among the elementary measures the American Soviet government will adopt to further the Cultural Revolution are the following. The schools, colleges, and universities will be coordinated and grouped under the National Department of Education and its state and local branches. The studies will be revolutionized, being cleansed of religious, patriotic, and other features of the bourgeois ideology. The students will be taught on the basis of Marxian dialectical materialism, internationalism, and the general ethics of the new socialist society. Well, let's just stop right there and understand what some of these words are. First of all, notice they're going to use education for a cultural revolution. This was, again, a communist leader in America writing in 1933. We also have learned in past programs that the Frankfurt School, the cultural Marxist Frankfurt School guys who ran the Institute of Marxism in Germany, that was formed in 1923, and then they came to America after 1933 when Hitler came to power, they said, too, they were going to attack the existing morality of our culture. As Marxist, they were going to come to America, not call themselves Marxist, but they were going to go after education and media and have a cultural revolution and attack the existing morality of our culture, right? And have a cultural revolution. Well, here's another communist, and this is in 1932, saying the same thing. And he says, and we're going to create a Department of Education. Well, you can thank socialist Jimmy Carter for giving us the U.S. Department of Education, now can't you? And this has exactly been the communist plan laid out here by a communist leader in 1932. Then he says the students will be taught on the basis of Marxian dialectical materialism. Now, remember, last week we did a whole broadcast on the dialectical materialism of Karl Marx. I'll sum it up again here in just a few minutes for anyone that's new. And then he says we'll teach them about internationalism. What's another word for internationalism? Globalism. And what is globalism opposed to? National sovereignty. And is there a battle going on today between those who want globalism and those who want nation states, borders, sovereignty? Indeed, there is. And so notice the communists are saying, hey, we're going to take over education in America. We're going to teach them Marxism and globalism. Well, that was 1932. Look at this. This is from 1946. And this is a report by the United Nations Education, Scientific, Cultural Organization, known as UNESCO. By the way, in 2018, President Donald Trump pulled the funding from UNESCO. Thank you, President Trump. And after you hear what Julian Huxley, their first executive director, said, their goal was, you'll be thankful that President Trump, at least for this time period, for this administration, has pulled the funding from UNESCO. You can pretty much count on the fact that the next president will restore that funding. But Julian Huxley, the first director of the United Nations Education, Scientific, Cultural Organization, wrote a paper in 1946 in which he said, quote, the task is to help the emergence of a single world culture. At the moment, two opposing philosophies of life confront each other. You may categorize the two philosophies as supranationalism, or as individualism versus collectivism, or as capitalism versus communism, or as Christianity versus Marxism. Can these opposites be reconciled? This antithesis be resolved in a higher synthesis? I believe not only that this can happen, but through the inexorable dialectic of evolution, it must happen, end quote. All right, we've given this quote many times over the years. What's he saying here? We want a single world culture. We don't want nation states. We don't want American values. We don't want American ideas. We want a single world culture. Globalism, world values. No one can be better than anyone else. We want socialism. And then he goes on to say that to do this, we have to have a dialectic. We have to have a battle between thesis and antithesis, idea and opposite idea, the thesis and the antithesis, the thesis, idea, and opposite idea. And again, we've explained a million times. You can do this with socialism and capitalism. And they fight and merge, become a new third option, moving the ball down the field. Because people get tired of the conflict, so they compromise, blend a little bit of this, blend a little bit of that, go along with the group consensus. Voila, we have a new thesis. Oftentimes, we see on Capitol Hill, legislation is offered up by the Republicans, option A. By the Democrats, option B. They're totally opposed to each other, and they fight, and they fight, and they give speeches, and they debate on the floor of the House and the Senate, and nothing is moving, and there's gridlock. And then up steps a member of the Republican Party and a member of the Democrat Party with option C, and they say, hey, look, guys, we've taken a little bit of A, we've taken a little bit of B, and we think here we have option C, a little bit of both. And both groups say, okay, fine, because nothing's being done, we're not getting anywhere. The Democrats don't want option A, the Republicans don't want option B, but hey, we'll get a little bit of something for each party and take option C. Well, option C was always the plan. Option C was what they always knew they had to do, but they had to go through the dog and pony show of A and B fighting each other to get anyone to even want option C. Well, this is known as the Hegelian dialectic process from German philosopher George Hegel, who greatly influenced Karl Marx. And so this idea goes on in the area of economics, religion, public policy. And that's what Julian Huxley, the first executive director of the United Nations Education, Scientific, Cultural Organization, is saying. We have to set up the conflict to get people to want to compromise and blend their ideas and keep moving the ball down the field as everything is evolving. Everything's always changing. That's a big part of what we learned last week when it comes to dialectical materialism, right? Dialectical. We live in a material world where everything is fighting and merging with each other, and this process is always going on, always going. There are never any absolute truths that are static and stay the same. Everything is always changing. Society evolves, morals evolve, the law evolves, right? And that's what Julian Huxley is saying. We deliberately want this conflict so that we can have this evolutionary process continue and become more and more advanced. So that was Julian Huxley in 1946. Well, how about this quote? This is a 1963 interview from Newsweek. And Newsweek was interviewing Marxist and United Nations Secretary General U Thant. Now, that was his name, U Thant, and he was a Marxist, and he was the head of the United Nations. And when Newsweek interviewed him in 1963. This is what he said, quote, "I believe in the philosophy of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. From its present antithesis, I believe the world is moving toward a new synthesis." Again, what's he saying? We're just simply going to set up conflict. We're going to set up conflict. And when we set up conflict between opposing views, that process brings about change. Just what Saul Alinsky said. Saul the Red Alinsky, who Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton studied. What did he say? Saul the Red Alinsky? The change comes from the conflict. The change comes from the conflict. In other words, you can't let a good crisis go to waste. You use any kind of crisis to bring about the change, to get people to do what they otherwise would not agree to do because they're tired of the conflict, right? And so this is what the Marxist and head of the United Nations was saying back in 1963. Have you noticed the theme here? All of these people are promoting the same concept, the same idea of deliberately setting up conflict to bring about change through the Marxist idea of dialectical Marxism. Well, John Stormer, in his book None Dare Call It Treason, said, quote, "Newsweek did not tell its readers, but Thant's philosophy is a simple restatement of Hegel's dialectic, the basis or root of Karl Marx's dialectical materialism. Thant has also adopted another Marxist idea to finance the synthesis, toward which he sees the world moving, the one world socialistic government financed by the United States," end quote. So what is John Stormer here saying? He's saying in his excellent book, None Dare Call It Treason, that Newsweek didn't bother in 1963 to tell the people that Hugh Thant was a Marxist that's promoting the philosophy of George Hegel, which is, let's deliberately set up conflict so people will embrace change. And what is Hugh Thant for? Let's have the nation states of the world pay for promoting socialism. And what you're going to find out tonight, folks, is that you, the American taxpayer, are paying for a socialist indoctrination and brainwashing of America's children, and it's being led by the United Nations. That's right. We, the taxpayers, are paying to have the United Nations come into our country and into our schools and brainwash our children with ideas and values that will collapse our own government. And yet, why aren't there more people talking about this? Because you, my friends, are the minority. The people who actually turn off stupid television, turn off Dancing with the Stars and other things, and actually want to think and learn and understand what's happening and why. And it's going to get a lot more interesting, so stay tuned. Now let's just refresh for anyone who's new, and even if you were with us last week, it's been a week since we were together, maybe we need a little refresher on the dialectical materialism that these guys all keep talking about, because they've been talking about it a long time. Well, remember, we have a foundation. Every house has a foundation. And we said last week that, in our analogy, that America is the house. And we have a foundation. And what is our foundation in America? It's Christianity and capitalism. Christianity and capitalism are Judeo-Christian ideas and ethics. And from our foundation, we then practice a Judeo-Christian worldview ethic in the area of law. We believe the law is not changing all the time. We believe the law is static. We believe the Constitution is static. We don't believe it's a living, breathing document. We don't believe, as the liberals do, that society evolves, morals evolve, thus the law evolves. The American people wouldn't accept same-sex marriage back in the 50s, but now they do. They wouldn't accept the idea of abortion in 1950, but now they do. They wouldn't accept the idea even in the 1990s maybe, or the 1980s of legislation that says you can kill a baby right after it's born. You can kill a baby. Go ahead, kill it. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if it's in the womb, outside the womb. If the parent doesn't like the child, they can kill it. Well, how many people would accept that idea in the 1970s and 80s? But today, apparently that's something society is willing to accept, and there are numerous states now that allow for this. Why is it? Because these people believe that as society evolves, morals evolve, the law evolves. Everything's evolving. Everything's changing. Well, conservatives and those who believe in absolute truth, and our founding fathers who based our Constitution and Bill of Rights on the idea of moral law, the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, they believed in fixed, static values. In fact, when they created a constitutional republic, they deliberately did just that. They didn't create a democracy. They said that, as I told you earlier, that was a mobocracy. That was the rule of the 51%. They said, we don't care what the 51% wants. 51% might want something that goes against the character and nature of God, and they shouldn't be able to have it. Thus, we won't leave it up to the hearts of men to decide. We'll create a constitutional republic that is based on static, fixed truth. And when William Blackstone, the leading scholar for the Founding Fathers, was asked, well, what is a constitutional republic? He said it is this: what the divine has ruled on, we don't rule against. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not steal. You see, this then became the basis for our economics. Well, if you can steal something, then that must mean that someone has private property. Because if there is no such thing as private property, how could you take from somebody something? How could you take something from them if they don't have private property? So thou shalt not steal denotes there is private property. And so from that Judeo-Christian ethic, we have our idea of law, fixed law, private property, private contract, private ownership, and we keep applying that Judeo-Christian ethic, which is the foundation of our house, to those disciplines: law, science, economics, history, government, family, social issues, religion, and education. But, my friends, we have to understand that the foundation enables the house, and the house maintains the foundation. In other words, if anyone inside the house starts to doubt the foundation and works to change the foundation, then the principles or practices or disciplines of life in the area of law, science, economics, history, government, family, social issues, education, religion, and education will also change. And then all of a sudden, the law will be used as an instrument for evil, not for good. And then we know that internal contradictions compromise the foundation. And as a result, they result in a revolution within the house and change the values and conduct of its occupants. So how do you have a revolution in a country? You bring in internal contradictions. You bring in United Nations curriculum. You bring in communist Marxist curriculum. You bring in Islamic curriculum that undermines the foundation and contradicts the values and disciplines of the members of the House in the area of law, science, economics, history, family, social issues, education, and religion. And when you bring in those internal contradictions and you create that thesis and antithesis and that battle, then that begins to change the worldview of the people. Then the people want to change the foundation. Now they don't any longer want their government based on absolute truth. Now they don't want the foundation of their nation based on Judeo-Christian ethics and a free market capitalism. Now, because we have allowed for years and years this conflict, this fight, this battle, these internal contradictions, we've allowed them to come into the house, and now people want to have a revolution, and they want to change the foundation, and they don't want capitalism. Now we have 58% of millennials wanting to live under some form of communism, be it fascism, socialism, or communism, according to a study in November 2017. How is it 58% of millennials and many adults now want to live under socialism? Because there were internal contradictions that were allowed to come in. They were allowed to come into our media and education and religion, and they created conflict and they confused people. Other people said, I don't want the conflict, and they compromised. Others didn't even know there was a brainwashing re-education process going on, so they could not fight back. It's like the men of the Korean War. When they came home and they were told what had happened to them, they said, if we had only known, if we had only known, we could have resisted. If we'd only known what it was they were doing, we could have fought back. If we'd only been more educated in our way of life, our form of government, and why our government is a constitutional republic and what maintains that, then we could have refuted their ideas, but we didn't know. And many within the House of America have had these internal contradictions come in, and they don't know enough to withstand the re-education that's been going on. And now we have a lot of people that want to change the foundation of our country. And that's how you have a revolution without firing a shot. And that's exactly what Herbert Marcuse said of the Frankfurt School, the man who coined the phrase, make love, not war. I paraphrase. He said, the old way of revolution is old-fashioned. The new way is a diffused and dispersed disintegration of the system. And how are they going to do this? By attacking the existing morality of the culture, attacking the existing morality of all the institutions of America: law, economics, family, education, religion, and we'll use the media to do it. And after many years of internal contradictions, re-education, brainwashing, fake news, information operation, fake history, now we have enough Americans that want to actually change the foundation of our government. This is what is known as dialectical Marxism. Setting up that dialectical, that conflict, thesis and antithesis, opposites colliding, internal contradictions, until enough people say, we can change the foundation. So, a foundation of dialectical materialism enables material conditions that create the morality of a society. That's what Marxists believe. Marxists believe that dialectical materialism, meaning material matter, money, production, goods, services, that matter, that money, that financial and material state can create the morality of a society. In other words, why is there crime? Because people don't have enough money. Give them enough money, give them a mandatory minimum income, they'll stop being involved in crime. Whereas our founding fathers and people who hold to a Christian worldview understand, as Jeremiah said, the heart is desperately wicked above all else. Who can know it? We live in a sinful, fallen world. Socialism won't work because we live in a sinful, fallen world. And people will be selfish when they see other people are willing to work to pay their way. Their sinful nature says, well, why work? And even our own forefathers of this nation tried socialism. The colonies under Bradford tried socialism. And what did they find? People realized they were going to get 3 square meals a day and shelter whether they worked or not. So they chose not to work and to sit around and watch others do their work for them. This didn't go so well, and so Bradford said, we're going to have private property. We're going to be based on capitalism. You don't work, you don't eat. We're going to go back to a Judeo-Christian ethic when it comes to economics. And America flourished. The original colonies flourished under Bradford when they moved away from socialism. But why won't it work? Because we have a sinful, fallen creation, sinful, fallen man. So socialism doesn't work. But the Marxist believes it will work. It just hasn't been done correctly. And if we just give people enough money, a mandatory minimum income, they'll stop doing bad things. And we'll have a just society. Well, they're wrong. If that were the case, socialism would have succeeded a long time ago. But we know, because of man's sinful heart, people will not take responsibility. They will steal from others. They will not get up and go to work. If they can get the check, they're going to get the check and not work. But that's what they teach. A foundation of dialectical materialism enables material conditions that create the morality of a society. Thus, the ownership of the means of production must be controlled by the state, so material wealth can be redistributed in an equitable manner that creates just and fair society for the benefit of all. That's what they believe. And that, my friends, is how you have a revolution in America. And that's what we're going through now. Now look at this. Did you know that there was American communists that supported the founding of the United Nations? Yeah, American communists supported the founding of the United Nations. Let's look at this quote from 1945. April 1945, the Communist Party USA used their journal to call for support of the formation of the United Nations. Quote, great popular support and enthusiasm for the United Nations policies should be built up, well organized, and fully articulate. But it is also necessary to do more than that. The opposition must be rendered so impotent that it will be unable to gather any significant support in the Senate against the UN Charter and the treaties which will follow. Well, my friends, that was in April of 1945. And in October 1945, the Charter went through and the United Nations was established in America. The communists wanted the United Nations. Why? Because the ideas embodied in the United Nations are in many regards consistent with that of the communist, the Marxist. Have you read the Communist Manifesto lately? One of their ideas, of course, is globalism, world communism. Well, what has the United Nations been for many years? It's been about just that. Redistribution of wealth, socialism, Marxism, globalism, world government, ending of national sovereignty and borders. And of course, now today, the United Nations is infiltrated by both Islamists and Marxists. What we call the red-green axis, the red being Marxism and the green being the green of the jihadi Islamist flags, a red-green axis to bring down America. And they can unite for many reasons. They believe in dictatorships. They believe in tyranny. They believe in socialism. Many people don't realize that one of the tenets of Islam is social justice. Social justice was a term that was used by Karl Marx, but it was created by Luigi Tapernelli, a Jesuit priest, in 1840. And then along comes Karl Marx in 1848 with his Communist Manifesto. Social justice. Well, the Islamists believe in social justice. Go look that one up. That's a major tenet of Islam. So they can unite around the idea of world domination. They can unite around the idea of socialism or social justice. They don't have any respect for women. The Islamists don't. We know that. Muslim man can have up to 4 wives. They can divorce them, get another one. They can be involved with prostitutes. If you go study the writings of the imams and those who interpret things like Reliance of the Traveler, which is one of the leading law books of Islam. Go read the Quran, the Hadiths. You'll see this. So they don't have respect for marriage. You can have 4 wives, you can divorce, get another, you can have prostitutes. What do the communists believe about marriage or family? Karl Marx believed in communal wives. So they're united on that. They're united on many things. Their hatred of capitalism and Christians and absolute truth. So they'll unite around the things they agree on, mainly who their enemies are. And so they'll unite together in a red-green axis to destroy their enemies, and they'll work out who's going to be in charge later. And so the United Nations today is a collection largely of Marxist and Islamist nations coming against our way of government. But it was in 1945 that the communists in America said in April of 1945, hey, let's do everything we can to make sure the United Nations comes about and do everything we can to undermine those people who don't want the United Nations. Well, in October of that year, the communists got their wish. They got the United Nations. John Stormer, in his book None Dare Call It Treason, wrote, quote, the communists knew in advance that the structure of the UN could be used to prevent it from ever acting against the communists. They knew what few Americans realize even today. In 1948, when Alger Hess was exposed as a communist agent, the web of protective propaganda which guards the UN prevented most Americans from learning that he had been the UN chief architect, end quote. You see, many people have forgotten American history. Many don't even know this. There was a man at the State Department, rather high up, Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss helped to form the United Nations. He was heavily involved in the creation of the United Nations, and some have called him one of the leading architects of the United Nations. He was a communist. He eventually was exposed as being a communist agent inside the State Department. But here we have a major communist, Marxist, as one of the leading, if not the leading architect of the United Nations. Well, remember, my friends, the point we're looking at here is, and our 10 strategies for brainwashing a people is entice the brainwashing subjects into questioning and doubting their foundational worldview, values, and convictions. And one way that is done, my friends, is through the United Nations education plan. Their global education plan we've already talked about. But what was the forerunner to the global education plan? It was known as the International Baccalaureate. It was officially started with the help of UNESCO in 1968. Remember, I gave you the quote by Julian Huxley of UNESCO, who wanted a single world culture. And that meant having conflict between opposites, including Christianity and Marxism, individualism and collectivism. Well, UNESCO helped to found, officially in 1968, the International Baccalaureate. It's again, the forerunner to global education of the UN. And today, the International Baccalaureate, this UN school, which teaches anti-American ideas and values, is in about 2,000 schools in America and growing. And we're paying for it. Well, here's an article from U.S. News and World Report back in 2011. International Baccalaureate undermines U.S. founding principles. Did you see the headline again? International Baccalaureate undermines U.S. founding principles. Didn't we learn that through the dialectical process or through the dialectical materialism, that's what you got to do? Have to have conflict to undermine the foundation? We know the communists love the United Nations. They help bring it about. They love their ideas and values. And here comes the United Nations with their International Baccalaureate program to indoctrinate America's kids and undermine America's U.S. founding principles. In the 2011 U.S. News and World Report article, we read, quote, should we spend taxpayer dollars on a public school curriculum commissioned by the United Nations, made in Europe, and at odds with the principles of the American founding? Through the International Baccalaureate program that's already underway, across the country, public schools, primarily high schools, but also middle and elementary schools, are paying into the International Baccalaureate program. The article goes on to say, now there are 1,296 IB world schools in the United States, non-governmental organizations of the UN's Economic and Social Council. Do you want to hear from the horse's mouth? An excellent source of evaluating IB is A Continuum of International Education, published by the International Baccalaureate Organization in 2002. From this document, we learn that the goal of the International Baccalaureate is not merely to impart knowledge or teach skills, but rather to develop, quote, citizens of the world, end quote, with, quote, universal human values, end quote. Well, what are these values? Not necessarily the values of the student's parents or faith, but those embodied by the UN Declaration of Human Rights. That document decrees that, quote, education shall further the activities of the United Nations, end quote, presumably including activities not endorsed by the United States, such as the Declaration of the Rights of the Child and the Kyoto Protocol. Another controversial international baccalaureate connection is the Earth Charter, a sweeping blueprint of international rights and responsibilities promoted by Mikhail Gorbachev, among others. The Earth Charter advocates the redistribution of wealth among and within nations, population control policies, abolition of, quote, all forms, end quote, of discrimination based on sexual orientation, presumably including traditional marriage, and military disarmament. The Charter also decrees that all nations, quote, must support the implementation of the Earth Charter principles with an international legally binding instrument on environment and development, end quote. Until recently, the IB organization was listed among official Earth Charter endorsers. And former International Baccalaureate Director Ian Hill affirmed that, quote, the International Baccalaureate endorses the Earth Charter and suggests many topics that promote it, end quote. As controversy grew about this connection, however, International Baccalaureate announced its website that it had, quote, withdrawn its endorsement, end quote. Many observers are skeptical that this about phase constituted a substantive change rather than a politically motivated dodge, end quote. Well, you can be sure of that, because to be an international baccalaureate school, you have to embrace and endorse what the United Nations embraces or endorses. So if parents got upset because of the Earth Charter and what was in it, and they wanted to do a political stunt and say, okay, we're going to pull our endorsement, that's baloney. You can't pull your endorsement of United Nations policies and be a part of the International Baccalaureate. The International Baccalaureate, they are required to stand with what the United Nations stands with. So many Americans, unfortunately, probably bought that trash. Well, again, the United Nations curriculum, this was written in 2011, is in far more than 1,200 schools in America now. It's now in closer to 2,000 schools. But please remember, this was the test for bringing about global education in all the schools of not only America, but the world. So again, this started in 1968, but it was just simply the test phase for developing the curriculum, introducing it to nation states, and then say, hey, why don't we do this for all the schools? And that's exactly what we have with our global education plans from America 2000 to Goals 2000 to No Child Left Behind to Common Core. It really all goes back to the United Nations and their International Baccalaureate that was really the forerunner to all of it. Well, are you familiar with the founder of the International Baccalaureate? Teresa Moret? Well, this is what she said, quote, the concept of nationality must be minimized in order to encourage students to develop a picture of the whole world. History should not be taught until well into adolescence because for the younger student, it inevitably consists of a series of stories and myths glorifying violence and misrepresenting events by giving them a nationalistic bias, end quote. What's she saying? We don't want to teach history to kids until they're well advanced in age. Why would you not want to teach true history, the good, the bad, and the ugly? Because they don't want students immersed in the founding documents of America, our way of life, our principles, our ideas, our worldview, our Judeo-Christian ethics system upon which our law is based. They don't want real history taught. They want global values taught. This is the founder of the International Baccalaureate program. IB is showing the way. That was the name of an article that's published on the website of the International Baccalaureate back in May of 2008, and it declared, quote, young people need to feel first of all global citizens, second, national citizens, and third, local citizens. Among my generation, it is the other way around. Change will be difficult, but schools are already thinking about curriculum changes, end quote. So what's the goal? Global citizens. Here is Elena Johnson writing an article titled The Link Between Declining National Education Quality and the United Nations Agenda 2030. Quote, with grants and taxpayer dollars, students are brainwashed into global citizenship, social justice, intercultural understanding, and respect. In other words, submission to one world socialist government. Well, she's absolutely right. This is a screenshot right off the International Baccalaureate website. Notice what they say. The first International Baccalaureate school came here to America in 1971, and as of today, there are over 1,800, 1,819 to be precise, and growing. And here we see the breakdown of the primary years program, 563 schools, middle years program, 649 schools, diploma program, 942 schools, and career-related program, 106 schools. Well, here's an article from the Associated Press. International baccalaureate programs catch on in the U.S. This was dated last year, July 10th, 2018. Quote, the two-year International Baccalaureate curriculum, developed in 1968 at the International School in Geneva, is now offered in 931 American schools, 87% of them public schools, and dozens more have begun the long certification process. The number of IB schools around the world exceeds 4,700, spanning 150 countries, and is expected to surpass 7,000 in the next 5 years. To earn an IB diploma, students must devote their junior and senior years to the program, which requires English plus another language, math, science, social science, art, and a course in the theory of knowledge, a 4,000-word essay, oral presentations, and 150 recommended hours of community service. Well, again, that all sounds good until you delve into the curriculum and you find out the trash they're learning, even in what are so-called math classes. That has nothing to do with math. Well, again, we'll get into that. This is a screenshot from the International Baccalaureate website where they're having their global conference coming up in New Orleans in 2019. Notice what one of the themes will be: social justice. Social justice. That's another word for socialism. Well, shocker. Here's the United Nations Secretary General, who is also a Marxist, U Thant. He gave a speech in 1962. And what was he talking all about? Social justice. And again, are we shocked then that the United Nations has a curriculum that pushes social justice? U Thant said, quote, the concept of taxing the rich according to their capacity to pay in order to cater to the poor according to their needs is now well established as a simple canon of social justice. In all democratic countries, it requires only a little imagination to lift these concepts to a higher plane, namely the international plane, and to extend its scope from the country to the universe, end quote. What's he saying? Karl Marx. Each according to his need, each according to his ability. We're going to take from one, the rich countries, and give to the other. And by the way, Pope Benedict, Pope Francis, they've all been pushing this Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development. They've been pushing this themselves. In the 1946 book, The World Character and Road to Peace, by Stuart Chevalier, we find this statement, quote, peace is not the absence of war, peace is the presence of justice. See, what you have to understand, folks, is they don't mean the same things that you and I mean. When they talk about justice, or they talk about peace, or they talk about terrorism, the Islamists do the same thing. They have totally different meanings to these words than you do. By peace, the Islamists mean when you submit. Well, the Marxists believe peace is not the absence of war. Peace is the presence of justice. And by justice, what do they mean? Social justice. So there's real peace and unity when there's been redistribution of wealth, socialism. So you need to understand they count on the fact that the average American does not know what they mean by these words, peace or justice. Now, a while ago, there was made reference to this article or these papers written by Ian Hill. He was the Deputy Director General of the International Baccalaureate Organization from 2000 until 2012. Now, I had the joy yesterday, of reading this trash that Ian Hill wrote. These are just two of the papers that he wrote that I've gone through and taken screenshots of. I'll show you more of his screenshots next week because it's really shocking. I mean, you're going to understand what's happening, folks, in America and the world when you watch this presentation, and next week, and the week after that, for that matter. But so much of what's going on, you'll say, wait a minute, that's what's happening. That's what they're doing. Yes, and these documents and some of these things were written years ago, generations ago, by the way. And yet we have people who claim to be Christians, claim to be conservatives, who want to say that what we push is conspiracy theories. This isn't conspiracy theories. Do you see the documentation? Look at the documentation. This is just a small portion of the documentation. No, I meant the wide shot. Look at that stack. I mean, that's just one of many stacks. This is documentation that proves what these people are saying. These are their own papers, their own reports. They put it out there on their own websites. They don't hide this. This isn't discussed in some smoke-filled room. You can go to their websites and print this stuff out and read it. Have at it. But how many people you think really do? Next to no one. That's why we do what we do. That's why you're here. That's why our organization is growing. because they want someone to spend the boring hours. Look, I've got over 20 hours into preparing this 1 hour. 20 hours. Easily over 20 hours preparing this 1 hour. Now, who do you have time to do that? You probably have another job of your own to do. This is my job. You have a job. You can't do your job and do my job, and I can't do your job. But we all have our part to play, don't we? And I'm glad you're here. And many of you who support us because you get up and go to a job enables me to do this job and do the research and bring it to you. You see how we work in concert together? But the average American doesn't realize this isn't conspiracy. This has been openly written in their own papers and their own documents. Next week, we'll have time to get to it next week. Here's a document. This is put out by the United States Senate. Yeah, and yet there are well-known conservatives and evangelicals that would say, oh, that's all conspiracy talk. Well, here's the United States Senate. See the little logo of the United States Senate? Here's the report that I've been reading. Look like fun? What is it? Chinese impact on the U.S. education system. It's a staff report. It's a staff report put out by the Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs. In other words, hey, we have a threat to our homeland security. What's the threat? China, communist red China, has infiltrated America's schools. And by the way, they're buying off America's schools. They're spending millions of dollars to get into local schools. Oh, and by the way, many of these local schools are breaking federal law, and they're not reporting that the communist Chinese have bought their way into their school. So you not only have the Communist United Nations, which is backed by the Islamists, in America's schools, you also have the Chinese buying their way into America's schools. Then we could talk about next week the Islamic curriculum being funded by the Department of Education to teach Islam to America's schools. Wait a minute. We're so busy teaching Marxism and Islam to America's students. When do they have time to learn about our constitutional republic, capitalism, the free market system? I guess they don't have much time for that, which is why there are internal contradictions inside our house, which is changing the foundation, which is why now we have 58% of millennials wanting to live under some form of communism, because dialectical materialism and the setup and conflict has occurred and been successful while Americans were asleep. Now, folks, if you appreciate what we're doing here and bringing it to you each and every week, we can only do this, as I said earlier, because you partner with us. And if you'd like to make a tax-deductible contribution, you can do that online right now at WVW-Foundation.com, or you can send a check to our mailing address that you'll find on our website as well, WVW-Foundation.com, to make a tax-deductible contribution so we can keep this program plus all the many others going. We have some new programs coming online in the next few weeks, one with well, actually, we have a couple of people who are involved formerly in national intelligence who are now retired, and they have come to us to produce their national television show. So go check out all the shows at WVW-TV.com, WVW-TV.com. We have more coming, and we produce all those shows. These people don't pay us to produce their shows. We fly them in, we put them up, we produce them, we distribute them. This is what we do. We do this for them free of charge. We do not charge them. How do we do it? Because of people like you that partner with us so we can offer conservative programming just like this. WVWFoundation.com. Now, if you'd like to have access to all of our shows from years gone by, we have a VIP club, situationroom.net. Situationroom.net if you'd like to join our VIP club. I hope you'll join us next week as we have part 5 on Brainwashed America and continue to look at how the Marxists, the Islamists, have infiltrated, with the help of the United Nations, our schools. And then we'll go through the report put out by the Committee on Homeland Security, the U.S. Senate, saying China is now buying their way with communist China propaganda into America's schools, brainwashing America's children, bringing internal conflicts into our house to destroy our foundation and have a revolution inside our own nation. You and I, my friends, are the ones who must lift up a shout and a warning. And if you and I don't do it, who will? Thank you so much for watching, for caring, and for learning, and for sharing this with others. Till next week, I'm Brannon Howse. Take care.